The Contract of Hope. The next morning dawned gray and heavy with mist, as if the sky itself hesitated to reveal what the day would bring. Emma stood before the mirror in her small rented room, brushing her hair with trembling hands. Every stroke through the strands felt like an act of courage, an effort to remind herself that she was still in control. The night before had been sleepless. Her mind had turned endlessly over the decision she had made. She had called Julian Blackwood. She had agreed to meet again. She had accepted that perhaps salvation never arrived in the form one expected. It came wearing expensive suits, speaking of contracts, and offering to change the trajectory of lives with the precision of a signature. The reflection staring back at her did not seem like the same woman who had arrived in the city weeks ago. Her eyes, once full of naive optimism, now held the dull glimmer of someone who had seen too much disappointment to dream freely anymore. Yet beneath that weariness flickered something else: resolve. She was doing this for her grandmother, for her brother and sister, for the fragile thread of hope that still tied her family together across miles of poverty and sacrifice. The car that waited outside the boarding house looked out of place on the narrow, cracked street. Its black surface reflected the pale light of morning, sleek and silent, as though untouched by the grime of the world around it. Neighbors peered through curtains as Emma stepped out, clutching her worn canvas bag, her heart pounding against her ribs. The driver, a man with silver hair and eyes that revealed years of quiet service, opened the door for her without a word. Inside, the air smelled faintly of leather and something expensive she could not name. The city rolled past the tinted windows, but it felt distant, muffled, as if she had stepped into another existence entirely. She pressed her palms together in her lap, whispering a silent prayer for strength. Every street they passed seemed to pull her further away from the life she knew and deeper into one she could neither predict nor understand. When the car stopped at the Meridian Tower, the world seemed to shift. Emma had seen the building before, but only from afar, where it looked like a monument to ambition. Up close, its walls of glass and steel felt almost alive, gleaming with cold power. The elevator carried her upward to the 32nd floor, her stomach twisting with each passing number. When the doors opened, she stepped into a world of white marble, quiet corridors, and the faint hum of success. Julian was already waiting, standing near the window that overlooked the vast city below. He turned as she entered, and for a moment she was struck again by how composed he seemed. He wore confidence the way others wore clothes, perfectly tailored, without a wrinkle or hesitation. "Good morning, Emma," he said, his tone calm but not without warmth. "I'm glad you came," Emma managed a nod. "I said I would." He gestured toward the table where Patricia Moreno, his attorney, sat with a folder that looked far too thick to contain just one woman's future. "This is Patricia," Julian said. "She's here to make sure everything is clear and fair to you." His gaze held hers for a heartbeat longer than necessary, as if silently asking her to trust that this would be handled with respect. She could not answer that look. Instead, she sat down across from the lawyer and listened as Patricia began to explain. The words blurred together at first: clauses, conditions, assurances. But slowly the meaning emerged. Every line of the contract had been written with a precision that frightened her. It spoke of medical arrangements, financial compensation, confidentiality, and the terms of the arrangement in phrases that sounded too clean for what they truly meant. Emma's hands tightened in her lap. This was no simple job offer. It was the rewriting of her entire existence. Yet the lawyer's tone was patient, and Julian's eyes never left her face. He watched not as a man who demanded obedience, but as one studying the fragile architecture of another person's decision. When Patricia finally paused, Julian leaned forward. "I understand how overwhelming this must feel," he said quietly. "I don't want you to think of this as a transaction. I want you to understand that I'm offering a partnership. You help me secure my future, and in doing so, you secure yours. No one will be forced, and no one will lose dignity. I'm not that kind of man." Emma's voice trembled when she finally spoke. "It sounds so easy when you say it like that. But this isn't just about money or paper. It's a life, a child. You're asking me to change everything I am." "I know," Julian replied softly. And that's why I'm not rushing you. You can walk away right now if this feels wrong. But if you stay, you will never be alone in this process. She looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time since entering the room. Beneath the perfect composure, she saw something unexpected. Weariness, the kind that came from living under pressure for too long. For the first time, she wondered if this man, for all his wealth and power, was just as trapped by circumstance as she was. Patricia excused herself briefly to take a call, leaving them alone. The silence between them was heavy, filled with questions that neither knew how to ask. Emma turned toward the window. The city stretched out endlessly, a maze of lives and choices, and she felt impossibly small within it. "Why me?" she finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "You could have chosen anyone, someone from your world." "Someone who understands this kind of arrangement." Julian's answer came slowly. "Because I've met those women. They care about what they can gain, not what they can give. When I saw you yesterday, tired, frustrated, but still standing proud, I saw someone who knows what sacrifice means. Someone who wouldn't see this as a game." "You saw a desperate woman," she corrected bitterly. "I saw a woman with courage," he replied, his tone steady. "And I value that more than desperation." Something inside her shifted then. She wanted to hate him for his offer, for making her consider something so unthinkable, yet his sincerity disarmed her. For the first time since arriving in the city, someone looked at her as though she mattered. When Patricia returned, the conversation turned practical again. The logistics, the legalities, the timelines, all the scaffolding of an arrangement that still felt unreal. When the contract was finally placed before her with a pen beside it, Emma stared at the space where her signature would go. Her heart pounded so hard she thought the room might hear it. She thought of her grandmother's frail hands, her brother's tired eyes, her sister's forced smile. She thought of the phone calls filled with hope they tried to disguise as faith. Then she thought of herself, the woman who had come to the city to save them and found herself standing at a crossroads she could never have imagined. Julian did not speak. He did not push. He simply waited, his gaze steady, as though he understood that this was not a business decision, but an act of survival. Finally, Emma picked up the pen. Her fingers trembled as she signed her name, each letter carving a line between the life she had known and the one that awaited her. When it was done, she set the pen down and exhaled a shaky breath that felt like releasing years of burden. Julian nodded to Patricia, who gathered the documents with quiet efficiency. "Everything will be processed today," the lawyer said. "Emma, you'll receive confirmation of the transfer for your grandmother's treatment within the hour. The apartment will be ready by this evening. My assistant will send you the address." When they were alone again, Julian approached her. "You've done something incredibly brave," he said. "I won't pretend this is simple, but I promise you, I will keep every word of my commitment." Emma looked up at him. "I didn't do this for bravery. I did this because I didn't have another choice." He inclined his head slightly. "Sometimes courage and necessity are the same thing." That afternoon, Emma stood before her new apartment, a spacious, sunlit home high above the noise of the city. It was more beautiful than anything she had imagined. The walls gleamed with soft colors, the furniture elegant yet warm. She walked through each room in silence, touching the surfaces as if afraid they would vanish. A bouquet of white lilies rested on the dining table with a simple card in Julian's handwriting. "For the new beginning you've earned." She sat down on the couch, the soft fabric swallowing her exhaustion. For the first time in months, the weight on her shoulders eased just slightly. A message arrived on her phone, a picture of her grandmother smiling weakly in a hospital bed, her brother's text saying, "They started the treatment today. She's going to be okay." Emma's throat tightened, tears spilling before she could stop them. For the first time in so long, she felt relief, and yet beneath that relief, a quiet fear lingered. What had she truly agreed to? What would this decision make of her? As the city lights began to glow outside, Emma stood by the window, looking down at the world that no longer looked the same. Somewhere across the skyline, Julian Blackwood was likely in another tower, reviewing numbers, attending meetings, appearing untouchable. Yet she sensed that beneath his composed surface lay something fractured too, something that perhaps only she in her strange new role might come to understand. That night, she lay in a bed softer than any she had known, unable to sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Julian's face, the calm eyes, the voice that had spoken of partnership, not power. Against her will, she wondered what kind of man could live surrounded by so much wealth and yet sound so quietly lonely. She wondered what it would mean to bring a child into such a world, one born not from love, but from an agreement written in ink and circumstance. And somewhere deep within her heart, buried beneath fear and exhaustion, a fragile hope whispered that perhaps this story, her story, was not yet defined by the terms of a contract. Perhaps it was still waiting to be rewritten by something far greater. The silent arrangement. The following morning began with the kind of quiet that unsettled her. There were no roosters greeting dawn, no sound of her brother chopping wood outside their farmhouse, no smell of cornmeal frying on a skillet. Instead, sunlight filtered through tall glass windows onto marble floors that reflected it like a mirror. The apartment seemed to hum with silence, its luxury almost oppressive. Emma brewed the coffee machine after 10 minutes of confusion, watching the dark liquids swirl into a porcelain cup that probably cost more than her month's rent back in Valley Springs. She took a sip and tasted guilt instead of sugar. Every comfort she saw, the soft rug beneath her feet, the warmth of the cup in her hands, reminded her that this new life was built on an agreement that felt both miraculous and unthinkable. She told herself she would not grow used to it, that she was merely borrowing this comfort until her grandmother recovered, until her siblings stood on their own feet again. But even as she made that promise, she sensed how easily human beings learn to adapt when the weight of poverty finally lifted from their shoulders. The first few days passed like a dream she couldn't interpret. An assistant named Clara arrived each morning with groceries, medical updates from the hospital, and envelopes of documents that needed Emma's signature, bank transfers, insurance approvals, receipts for her grandmother's surgery. Julian's name appeared on every page as the sponsor. Emma read each one carefully, her heart tugging between gratitude and unease. Sometimes she would glance toward the empty corner of the living room and imagine him standing there, watching her reaction. She did not know why she cared about what he might think. On the 5th evening, a message came through from an unknown number. Dinner tomorrow, 7 p.m., Blackwood residence. Car will pick you up at 6:30. For a moment, she considered refusing. She was not ready to face him again, not after signing her life into his hands. But a second message followed, "Please come. We need to discuss the next steps in person." That single word, "please," softened her resistance. She typed a brief confirmation and spent the next 24 hours in nervous anticipation. When the car arrived, she wore the only formal dress she owned, a navy blue piece that hugged her modestly and carried the faint scent of lavender soap. The driver, the same silver-haired man as before, greeted her with quiet respect. As the vehicle glided through the city, lights shimmered on the wet asphalt like rivers of gold. Julian's home stood on a hill overlooking everything, a structure of stone and glass surrounded by sculpted gardens. It looked less like a residence and more like a fortress built to keep the world at bay. Inside, the air carried the fragrance of cedar and polished oak. A butler led her through a hallway lined with photographs, black and white portraits of stern-faced ancestors, a lineage carved from ambition. Julian waited in the dining hall, standing beside a long table set for two. When he saw her, his expression softened. "You look beautiful," he said simply. It wasn't the flattery of a man seeking approval. It was an observation made with quiet sincerity. Emma's pulse quickened, though she disguised it with a polite smile. "Thank you," she replied. "I wasn't sure what kind of evening this was meant to be." "Informal," he said. "No lawyers, no contracts, just conversation." He gestured for her to sit. The dinner was exquisite. Grilled salmon, roasted vegetables, a dessert that looked too delicate to eat. Emma forced herself to take small bites, aware of how out of place she felt in this world of polished silver and perfect manners. Julian noticed her discomfort and began talking about ordinary things, the chaos of traffic, the unpredictability of weather, even the frustration of trying to find decent coffee outside the city. His voice carried warmth, his laughter rare but genuine. Slowly, the tightness in her chest eased. By the time dessert arrived, she was listening to him with something close to fascination. When the plates were cleared, he led her toward a smaller room lined with bookshelves. A fire burned quietly in the hearth. He poured them both tea and gestured for her to sit across from him. "I wanted to see how you were settling in," he said. "I know this transition can't be easy. It's different," she admitted. "The apartment is beautiful, but it doesn't feel like home yet." "It will," he said gently. "Home isn't about where you are. It's about when you stop feeling like you have to prove you belong." He looked into the flames for a moment before continuing. "When my mother died, I was 10. My father threw himself into work, and the house became an office with bedrooms. I grew up surrounded by everything except warmth. That's why I wanted a child, not just for inheritance, but to build something my father never could." Emma listened in silence. For the first time, she saw the cracks beneath his polished surface. This man who commanded entire corporations spoke now like a boy who had grown up without comfort. She wondered how long he had carried that loneliness, how many years it had shaped him. Her own memories of hunger and struggle felt suddenly closer to his than she expected. Pain, she realized, didn't recognize wealth. It only recognized hearts that endured it. "Julian," she said softly, "you could have adopted a child. Why go through something like this with me, a stranger?" He gave a faint, tired smile. "Because I didn't want charity. I wanted connection. Adoption felt noble but distant. I wanted a child who would know both halves of their story, mine and the woman who gave them life. I wanted honesty from the start, even if it came wrapped in difficulty." He paused, studying her face. "I didn't expect honesty to look like you, though." The room fell silent again, filled only by the crackling fire. Emma looked down, unsure how to answer. The words hung between them, heavy with meaning neither dared define. When she finally met his gaze, something unspoken passed between them, a recognition that whatever began as business was slowly bending towards something neither contract nor money could control. Later that night, back in her apartment, Emma replayed every word of their conversation. Julian's vulnerability had unsettled her more than his power ever could. She had expected arrogance, but she had found a man burdened by his own expectations. For the first time, she considered the possibility that they were both seeking redemption in their own way. She, for failing her family. He, for the emptiness his success could not fill. She sat by the window until dawn painted the sky silver, realizing that the line between necessity and affection was already beginning to blur. Days turned into weeks. Their meetings became frequent. Medical appointments arranged by Julian's team, discussions about timelines, legal follow-ups. But somewhere within those formalities, a quiet rhythm emerged. He began asking about her childhood, her dreams, her grandmother's favorite songs. He would listen intently, as if every small detail mattered. And Emma, despite her caution, began to look forward to those moments. His laughter, once rare, became a sound she secretly waited for. One afternoon, after a long meeting with the doctors, he walked her to the car himself. Rain had just begun to fall, soft and persistent. Instead of rushing her inside, he stopped beneath the awning, watching the drops blur the skyline. "You know," he said, "I used to think rain was a nuisance. Now I think it's the only thing that makes this city feel human." Emma smiled faintly. Back home, rain was a blessing. It meant the crops would live another season. He looked at her then, eyes softened by memory. "You miss it, don't you?" She nodded. "Every day." He didn't speak again, but he reached out and brushed a strand of wet hair from her face, his hand pausing for a heartbeat too long before he withdrew it. Neither of them said a word as she stepped into the car, but the silence pulsed with something new, an unspoken understanding that frightened and comforted them both. That evening, when Emma returned to her apartment, she received another message from Julian. "You reminded me what sincerity looks like." "Thank you." She stared at the words until her vision blurred, unsure whether to smile or cry. In the midst of this strange arrangement, sincerity was the last thing she expected to find. Yet somehow, It was becoming the very foundation of whatever bound them together. When walls begin to fall. Spring unfolded across the city with soft rains and brief bursts of sunlight that made the skyline glow like polished metal. From her window, Emma watched clouds drift above the towers and thought of how different her life had become in only a few months. The hospital had confirmed her grandmother's full recovery. Her siblings were back in school, and the steady income from Julian's arrangement had transformed her family's world. Yet even as she wrote cheerful letters home, she often paused, mid-sentence, realizing she no longer knew how to explain her own life. She was not a wife, nor an employee. She was something undefined, existing in a quiet space between gratitude and confusion. Every morning she promised herself she would keep her heart guarded, and every evening that promise felt weaker. Julian had become a constant presence. He visited often now, not always with purpose. Sometimes he brought documents for her to sign. Sometimes he arrived unannounced with coffee and a few minutes of conversation before rushing to a meeting. In the beginning, his visits made her nervous. His authority filled any room. But as the weeks passed, she began to see the small details others probably missed. The faint crease on his forehead when he was tired, the way his eyes softened when he spoke of things that mattered, the way his laughter emerged only when he forgot who he was supposed to be. She started to notice that when he spoke to her, his voice lost the clipped precision it held with everyone else. Around her, it carried warmth. One afternoon, Julian invited her to visit one of the foundations his company sponsored, a children's learning center on the city's east side. The car ride there was quiet until he asked, almost casually, "Do you ever think about teaching again?" Emma looked at him in surprise. "How did you know I used to?" He smiled. "I read the letter your former teacher wrote, the one you brought to your first interview. You've got patience written between the lines." She laughed softly. "Patience is easier when the students listen." He glanced at her. "And harder when they don't, but still worth it." Something in the way he said it made her heart skip. He wasn't just talking about children. He was talking about life. The learning center buzzed with noise and color, children painting, building, laughing. Emma walked among them with natural ease, kneeling beside a little girl struggling with a puzzle. Julian watched from a distance, hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable but not cold. Later, as they left, he said quietly, "You were happy in there." She nodded. "They remind me that innocence survives even when everything else feels too complicated." He hesitated before answering. "Maybe that's why I wanted this child, to hold on to something pure before I forget what that means." That night, she thought about his words long after he dropped her home. Beneath his confidence was a man still searching for meaning. She realized with an ache that she wanted to help him find it, not because of their agreement, but because she had come to care about the man himself. Weeks melted into each other. Medical appointments began for preliminary evaluations. Doctors spoke of schedules and compatibility tests. Julian attended every consultation, sitting quietly while Emma answered questions about her health and family history. His presence calmed her more than she expected. Once, after a long session, she found him waiting outside with 2 cups of tea. "I thought you might need warmth," he said, handing one to her. The simple gesture felt more intimate than anything they had shared before. She accepted it with trembling fingers, the cup heating her palms, and, strangely, her heart. Their connection deepened not through grand declarations, but through small kindnesses. He began calling her in the evenings just to ask how her day was. She learned that he read historical novels before bed because they reminded him that power was fleeting. She told him about the farm, about how the smell of wet soil used to make her feel safe. Slowly, their conversations moved from polite exchange to quiet confessions. When he laughed, she laughed too. When he sounded weary, she found herself wishing she could shoulder some of his burden. and though neither spoke of it directly, both began to realize that what bound them was no longer only the contract. One Sunday, he invited her to his private garden, a space no business associate had ever seen. It was vast, yet peaceful, filled with roses, wild ivy, and a single stone bench beneath an ancient oak. "My mother planted these," he said, tracing a leaf with his fingertips. "She said the roses would teach me patience. I never listened." Emma smiled. "They're still teaching." He looked at her then, a long, unguarded gaze that carried something deeper than courtesy. "Maybe I'm finally ready to learn." The air between them changed. The garden seemed to hold its breath. She felt his nearness, not commanding, not demanding, only present, as if he were asking permission to exist beside her. "Julian," she whispered, unsure of her own voice, "this was never supposed to become complicated." He nodded slowly. Nothing about life worth living stays simple. When his hand brushed hers, it wasn't the touch of a man asserting ownership. It was the touch of someone afraid to lose what he had just begun to understand. They stayed like that for a long time, saying nothing, the world around them fading into stillness. That evening, as she rode home, her thoughts were a storm. The boundaries of their arrangement were dissolving, and she didn't know whether to be frightened or grateful. She had agreed to carry his child, not his emotions, yet her heart was already carrying both. She reminded herself that this could end in heartbreak, that his world was built on structure while hers was made of survival. And yet, against reason, she hoped that perhaps two worlds could meet somewhere in the middle. A few days later, Julian called unexpectedly. His voice sounded tense. "My father has demanded a family dinner. He wants to meet you." The words froze her. "Meet me? Why?" "Because he's learned about the contract," Julian admitted. "He thinks it's another of my reckless ideas. I'd rather he see you than imagine the worst." Fear twisted in her chest. She wasn't ready for scrutiny from a man who had probably never spoken to anyone outside his circle as an equal. "If he disapproves, will that change the agreement?" she asked quietly. Julian's answer came firm. "No one changes my decisions, but I don't want you to feel cornered. If you'd rather not come, I'll handle it." Emma hesitated, then said softly, "I'll come. Maybe it's time someone reminded him that humanity still exists behind your business." The dinner that followed was tense. Julian's father, Arthur Blackwood, radiated authority. His words cut like measured blades. He spoke to Emma politely, yet every glance carried judgment. "So, you are the young woman my son has chosen for his key plan," he said, the pause heavy with disdain. Emma held her ground. "I'm the woman who agreed to help your son build a future he believes in," she replied. A flicker of surprise crossed the older man's face, but he said nothing further. Later, when they left, Julian caught her hand. "You stood up to him better than I ever did," he murmured. She smiled faintly. Maybe he just needed someone to speak without fear. "You've done more than that," he said, his voice low. "You've reminded me what courage looks like." That night, when she reached home, Emma felt exhausted but proud. For the first time since signing the contract, she felt like an equal, not a beneficiary. She realized she had given Julian more than he expected, not just a promise of lineage, but a mirror that showed him his own heart. As she closed her eyes, she wondered how long they could keep pretending this was only business. Love, she thought, never asked for permission. It simply arrived quietly and refused to leave. What the heart could no longer hide. The weeks after that dinner drifted like a calm tide. The hostility that had filled the air that evening settled into a wary peace. Arthur Blackwood no longer interfered, and for the first time Julian seemed free to breathe. Emma noticed it in his posture, his shoulders less rigid, his tone softer when he spoke to her. Something invisible between them had shifted. What began as a business arrangement now felt like the slow awakening of two souls who had forgotten how to be human. Yet both pretended otherwise, afraid to give shape to what they already knew. Their meetings grew longer. Work discussions melted into quiet dinners. Professional updates drifted into personal stories. Julian began to invite her to accompany him on trips connected with his foundations, saying he valued her perspective. One such trip took them to the coast, where his company funded a marine conservation project. The sea wind tangled Emma's hair as they stood on a cliff, watching waves crash against rocks. Julian's voice broke the rhythm of the surf. "I used to come here with my mother. She said the ocean keeps secrets for people who can't bear to speak them aloud." Emma smiled faintly. "Then it must hold millions." He turned to her. "Perhaps it holds ours too." The words hung between them, delicate and dangerous. Neither moved, but in that long silence, something deep inside them aligned. That evening, they dined on a terrace overlooking the water. Lantern light shimmered across his face, softening the angles that usually looked carved from ambition. They spoke little, content with the quiet. When the wind grew cold, Julian placed his jacket around her shoulders. His fingers brushed her collarbone. Warmth spread where his hand had been. "Thank you," she whispered. "You're welcome," he said, but his voice sounded rough, as though gratitude were too small a word for what he felt. She looked up and found his eyes fixed on her, not as a man measuring obligation, but as someone who had stumbled upon wonder. The moment could have stretched forever, but Emma looked away, frightened by the tenderness she saw there. She reminded herself why she was here, what promise had bound them. Yet when he smiled again, quiet and almost shy, she realized the line between duty and love had already blurred beyond recognition. When they returned to the city, the medical preparations resumed. Doctors spoke of cycles, tests, ideal timing. Julian handled everything with calm professionalism, but beneath that composure she sensed hesitation. One afternoon, as they left the clinic, he stopped in the parking area and said softly, "If at any point you wish to step away, say it." "I would understand." She met his eyes. "And if I don't want to?" He exhaled, the faintest tremor in his breath. "Then I'll make sure the world never hurts you for choosing me." For a heartbeat, they stood too close, the hum of traffic fading behind them, the weight of unspoken feelings pressing between every breath. Neither said another word, but both knew the conversation had changed everything. That night, Emma lay awake replaying those words. It wasn't a confession, but it was something more powerful, an admission that love had found them both, however unwillingly. She thought of her grandmother's favorite saying, "Love doesn't knock, it simply moves in and rearranges the furniture of your heart." Emma smiled through tears. Perhaps her grandmother had always known that love often arrived wearing impossible disguises. Days passed in a fragile balance. They continued their routine, pretending nothing had shifted, yet every glance and touch told a different story. One evening, Julian invited her to a charity gala, an event filled with people who measured worth by wealth and rumor. Emma hesitated but agreed. She wore a silver gown chosen by Clara, simple yet radiant. When Julian saw her, he froze for an instant, eyes tracing her not with desire but with awe. "You'll outshine everyone," he murmured. "I don't belong among them," she replied. "Neither do I," he said, offering his arm. "We'll survive together." The night glittered with chandeliers and shallow laughter. Reporters whispered. Flashes from cameras followed them. Emma felt exposed, but Julian never left her side. When a journalist made a cruel remark about her background, Julian's hand tightened gently around hers. "She's the most genuine person in this room," he said evenly, loud enough for others to hear. The insult dissolved into silence. For the rest of the night, people looked at her differently, not as a curiosity, but as the woman Julian Blackwood openly defended. On the drive home, she tried to thank him, but he stopped her with a shake of his head. "You owe me nothing," You've already changed more than you realize. She looked out the window at the blurred lights and wondered if he knew he had changed too. As months unfolded, the scheduled procedure approached. Everything was ready. The doctor spoke in calm certainties. Yet the night before, Julian appeared at her door unexpectedly. Rain dripped from his coat, his expression unguarded. "I couldn't sleep," he admitted. "I kept thinking, this was supposed to be a contract, and somewhere along the way it became a heartbeat." Emma's breath caught. He stepped closer, hesitated, then reached out as if seeking permission. She didn't pull away. His hand cupped her cheek. The world went still. "I don't know if what I feel is love or gratitude or madness," he whispered, "but it's real." Tears blurred her vision. "Then let it be real," she murmured. The distance between them disappeared, replaced by a quiet that spoke louder than any declaration. When he finally stepped back, his voice trembled. "Whatever happens tomorrow, know this. Nothing about you was ever part of a deal to me." After he left, Emma stood by the window until dawn. The city looked softer beneath the rain, as if it too understood transformation. She realized she was no longer the frightened girl clutching a letter of recommendation. She was a woman standing on the edge of a future shaped by courage, not desperation. Love had entered her life disguised as duty, and now it demanded truth. She didn't know where it would lead, but for the first time, she wasn't afraid. The choice that made them whole morning light crept across the skyline like a slow promise, touching every window of Meridian Tower with the pale gold of renewal. In the stillness of her apartment, Emma sat by the window with her hands folded over her stomach. The procedure was scheduled for that afternoon, and every minute that passed felt suspended between two worlds, the one she had known and the one she was about to create. She should have been nervous, but instead she felt calm, as if every step she had taken since leaving Valley Springs had been leading her here. Her grandmother's surgery had succeeded. Her siblings were writing her letters filled with laughter, and for the first time in her life, she had the power to decide her own direction. Yet beneath that calm lay a quiet question that refused to fade. What kind of life would this child enter if born from a contract instead of love? Julian arrived early. He didn't speak as he entered. He simply sat opposite her, watching the sunlight gather on the floor between them. The man who had once moved through life like a storm of certainty now looked hesitant, almost fragile. "You don't have to do this today," he said finally. "If there's even the smallest doubt, we can wait." Emma looked at him, and in that moment she saw everything. The fear, the hope, the longing he tried to hide behind reason. "Julian," she said softly, "this was never only about giving you an heir. It was about giving both of us a chance to start again." He reached for her hand and held it as if anchoring himself to something real. "Then let's start the right way," he murmured. "No contracts, no obligations, just trust." They drove to the clinic together. The air outside smelled of rain, and the city traffic moved like a slow pulse around them. In the waiting room, time seemed to stretch. Doctors walked in and out with practiced efficiency, but the world beyond that white corridor no longer mattered. Julian stood by the window, hands in his pockets, staring out as though trying to find courage in the shifting clouds. When the nurse called Emma's name, he turned quickly, eyes meeting hers. "Whatever happens in there," he said quietly, "I want you to know that you've already changed me." "I thought I was searching for a child, but I was really searching for you." Emma's throat tightened. She wanted to speak, but words failed. She nodded once, tears burning behind her eyes, and followed the nurse inside. Hours later, the procedure was over. The doctors assured her everything had gone perfectly, but Emma hardly heard them. She lay in the recovery room, her hand resting over her abdomen, feeling a strange mix of awe and peace. When Julian entered, he carried no trace of the businessman he once was. He looked like a man witnessing a miracle he didn't deserve. He knelt beside her bed, taking her hand in both of his. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice unsteady. "Not just for this, for believing that something good could come from someone like me." Emma smiled weakly. "You were never the man your father wanted you to be. You're becoming the man your mother hoped for." He bowed his head. overcome, and for the first time in years allowed his tears to fall without shame. The months that followed were a season of quiet transformation. The city outside remained ruthless and fast, but inside the walls of Emma's apartment there was warmth, laughter, and the gentle rhythm of life growing within her. Julian visited daily, bringing books about parenting and flowers from his garden. Sometimes they spoke for hours. Sometimes they simply sat in silence, sharing tea as if silence itself had become their language. One evening, as thunder rolled beyond the windows, Emma looked up from her book and said, "Do you ever regret how we began?" Julian thought for a long moment before answering. "If regret means wishing for something purer, then yes. But if it means undoing the path that brought me to you, then never." She smiled, resting her head against his shoulder. "Then maybe every wrong road still leads somewhere right." When her pregnancy reached its final months, Arthur Blackwood visited for the first time. He arrived unannounced, still dressed in the authority of his position, but his eyes betrayed curiosity rather than scorn. Julian met him at the door, tense, ready for confrontation. Yet Arthur's voice was unexpectedly quiet. "I came to see the woman who taught my son humility," he said. Emma rose from the sofa with effort, greeting him politely. The older man studied her for a long time, then gave a slow nod. "You've given this family something money never could. A conscience." It was not an apology, but it was acknowledgement. And in that brief moment, generations of pride seemed to loosen their grip. After he left, Julian stood silently by the window. Emma joined him, placing her hand over his. "He'll come around," she whispered. "He already has," Julian said, and kissed her forehead. The day their daughter was born arrived with a burst of early summer sunlight. The hospital room filled with the small cry that would forever rewrite their lives. Julian held the baby first, awe breaking across his face as he looked down at the tiny bundle. Then he turned to Emma, tears glistening in his eyes. "She looks like you," he said. "No," Emma whispered, smiling through exhaustion. "She looks like hope." He bent and kissed her forehead, his voice trembling. "Hope, that's what we'll call her." In that instant, the word felt right. It carried every sacrifice, every doubt, every miracle that had led them here. Months passed. Their home no longer echoed with emptiness. Laughter filled the halls, photographs replaced sterile art, and even Arthur Blackwood began visiting weekly to hold his granddaughter. The media whispered about Julian Blackwood's mysterious partner, but neither of them cared. The world could call it whatever it wished. They knew it had begun as necessity and become grace. Sometimes, in the quiet hours of night, Julian would watch Emma rock their daughter to sleep, her face illuminated by lamplight. He would remember the woman he had met in the lobby, her trembling hands clutching scattered papers, and marvel at how far they had both traveled from that moment. He no longer saw a contract or an arrangement. He saw the heartbeat of the family he had once believed impossible. One evening, as they sat on the balcony overlooking the glittering city, Julian took her hand and said, "Do you ever miss Valley Springs?" She smiled. "Sometimes. But I think home isn't a place. It's where someone waits for you at the end of the day." He nodded. "Then stay. Not because of obligation, not because of promises. Stay because you choose to." Emma looked at him for a long time, her heart full. "I already did," she said simply. Below them, the city pulsed with its endless rhythm, indifferent yet alive. Above them, stars appeared one by one, silent witnesses to a love that had defied every plan, every expectation, every rule. Julian wrapped his arm around her as their daughter slept in her cradle nearby. For the first time since either could remember, there was no deal to sign, no condition to meet, no fear to conquer, only the quiet certainty that sometimes the most unlikely beginnings create the truest endings. In the gentle hush of that night, with the city spread beneath them and their future resting peacefully within reach, Julian Blackwood and Emma Sterling finally understood that what had started as a transaction had become the purest form of redemption, a life built not on wealth or need, but on love freely given and deeply returned. End of story.